All right. Welcome, everyone, to my lecture on pawn structures, or pawn something. We're gonna just talk about pawns. So the pawn is an amazing piece. Never mind. Basically, a lot of pawn structure lectures have to do with a particular type of structure, whether it's hanging pawns or isolated pawns, a particular pawn structure like a Carlsbad, which we're actually going to look at today. But those things are fairly typical, and a lot of people do them. I've certainly done them. I might do them in future weeks. But what I wanted to do today was actually focus more on flexibility with pawn structures, because this game I found very interesting. This was played quite recently in the Tata Steel tournament between Peter Svidler-Hou Yifan, two extremely strong grandmasters. And I found what was interesting about this game was how many times, not just one pawn structure, but how many times the pawn structure changed, and how both players had to adapt to how the pawn structure changed. So that's kind of what I wanted to focus on, because so many games, so many lectures, really, people focus on, say, isolated pawn, but how often do you get an isolated pawn and then you don't have it anymore? You push it, the pawn structure changes. How do you adapt to when it changes? And that's kind of what I want to focus on today. I'll probably go off the rails as usual, but we'll at least give it a shot. So c4, so we get a queen's gambit declined. Bishop b4, slightly unusual. I find that one of the things I find very interesting in these super tournaments is that, people will actually play offbeat stuff more often than you'd think. And the reason is just people study these openings so much. They want to at least get something kind of fresh. And probably Hou Yifan didn't expect this from Svidler. Svidler usually plays like maybe some c4 knight f3 or 1e4, and probably she's just like, you know what, I don't want to deal with whatever you prepared. I'm going to play this move. But of course I'm speculating. It could have nothing to do with that. So they actually end up with a fairly mainstream line, the Ragozin. And Svidler decides now to surprise. He takes and plays bishop f4. So the main line here is the bishop going to g5, and it gets extremely sharp. I don't want to focus too much on the opening, but there's also queen a4 check lines, which are interesting. There are plenty of opportunities. But okay, he plays bishop f4. So you're asking yourself, why on earth would you not pin the knight? But this move has some subtle points. There are times when actually after bishop g5, black can play h6, g5 on you and kind of kick your bishop with gain of time. Knight e4 also can hit your bishop with a tempo. Here it does not. And it's simply developing the bishop before you play e3. So when you think about it logically, it's actually a very normal move. And I believe it's a trend that people are doing now. But I always like to ask myself when I see a move I don't know, what exactly is up? What are they up to with this move? So that's what the deal with bishop f4 is. Black castles, and white plays rook c1. So my first question to you guys is, why wouldn't white play the more obvious move here, to my eyes at least, which is e3? Why would white play rook c1 first? To me, that move looks a little strange. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there are definitely, white wants to support that knight, but is there a particular reason? Yeah?
Maybe after.
Keep in mind, white's not developed yet. So white just wants to get developed and get castled, and then start playing. White doesn't have any plans of trying to play c3, c4, or anything like that, most likely. White just wants to get developed first. If you try to do stuff like that before you're developed, usually very bad things happen to you. I know. So. That could be. My theory was actually that he was worried about c5. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that now, after takes, there's this move, along with whatever noises are being made. And this looked really annoying to me, because the knight's coming to e4. If you play rook c1, you have to contend with queen takes a2. And not that this is that clear. Usually white can sack some pawns and get castled and have compensation. But probably he just didn't want to deal with this. He wanted the structure to remain a little bit more, so what I'm looking for, a little bit more stable, a little bit more concrete. Once you play e3, c5, the pawn structure becomes loose, and the fact that you have a king in the center can really work against you. So he decided to go with this. So now the idea is if c5 is played now, and white takes, queen a5 doesn't work out so well because I can simply play a3. So that's why, I think rook c1 was played. It seems like a subtle thing, but I always ask myself in the openings, like, why are these guys doing this? Like, what exactly is the point of this move order? And I find that you can actually learn a lot about different openings and different structures by asking this question. So black decides, all right, no c5 for me, I'll just play c6. And now her claim is that, well, now your rook looks silly on c1. In Carlsbad structures, the rook often doesn't want to be here because, what's it really doing? This is not an open file, really. But OK, normal enough, e3. It's actually quite funny. I'd say the bishop on b4 and rook on c1 are both slightly wrong now. So she plays bishop d6, which is a fairly normal move. Trading these bishops, it looks a little strange to trade the bishop that's not on the opposite side color of your pawn chain. But in Carlsbad, I'd say all bishop trades are quite good for black, because black tends to have a little less space. So the bishop trade usually will actually help out. But I'd say the trade of light squared bishops tends to be more important. And this is kind of what I mean by pawn structure knowledge. Like takes, to know exactly what your goals are when you have this structure. And by the way, any bonus points for knowing which structure this is?
This is the Carlsbad, like you said.
Indeed. I'm just making sure people listen. It happens. But yeah, so this is a Carlsbad structure. So what do you guys know about a Carlsbad structure? It's important to kind of get your bearings to figure out, like, what do I know about this structure? What happens? Yeah, it's tricky. Like, if you don't know, it's hard to figure it out. So, I don't expect you guys to guess and stuff like that. But I'd say, like, one of the things I would recommend, and I can tell you that almost all GMs I know do this, which is that even if I don't play a particular structure, I'll try to learn about it. Like, one of the things that you'll notice is that GMs, no matter what pawn structure's on the board, will kind of have an idea. Now, if it's an opening we play, we'll know all the ins and outs. If it's an opening we don't play, we'll be like, I'm not exactly sure, but this is kind of where you play. This is kind of what happens. This is the breaks. We won't know all the details, but we'll kind of know how it works. And it's amazing how often this kind of thing comes in handy to know about different pawn structures. So learning, the Carlsbad is such a classic structure. I would say even if you never play it, learning a little bit about it can be useful. So there's a lot to go into. Usually there are multiple plans for white. Usually pushing on the queen side's a plan, trying to create weaknesses. White can play knight e5 and try to cement that knight. White can try to play f3, e4. This is usually in positions with the knight on e2, but that can happen. So there are multiple plans. And one of the things I would say that separates people who play these positions extremely well for white and people who don't is people who play them really well are not attached to one plan. They can play on the queen side. They can play in the center. Whereas if you watch a lot of like amateur players, they have one plan, and no matter what you do, that's the plan they're going for. And I just think it's a very poor mentality. It sounds like an obvious thing, but I think we've all been guilty of it at some point. So staying flexible with your plans is an important thing. But to return to the exact moment here, because you have to play a move, one of the most common themes here is that black wants to trade the bishops, which is something I told you before. So black already traded the dark squared bishops, but I would say the light squared bishops are even more important. If black can trade off the light squared bishop, even for a knight, it's quite advantageous because then black has no real bad piece, the knights come out, you put your pieces, and you can usually combat any of white's plans if you have fewer pieces on the board. White's plans become far less effective. So here, Svidler, in my opinion, played a very clever move. And it's the only move which, at least to my opinion, makes black's life a little complicated. It's not even objectively that much stronger than any other move, probably, but it's the only move I would not want to face as black. So what are your ideas? It's to do with the bishop on c8. So h3 would be a very direct move, right?
Yeah.
Not direct's maybe the wrong word, but it prevents bishop g4. But what does it allow?
Bishop f5.
Bishop f5, correct. So
maybe like knight h4, but that's pretty
knight 8, yeah, don't put your pieces on the edge of the board without a clear purpose. They don't like it. They'll resent you the rest of the game. It's not something you want. Yeah? Okay. So bishop d3 would be a normal looking move. However, black would play this. Now you have the pin. Nothing horrible has happened. It's not like, oh, bishop g4, just offer a draw, the game's over. But black's pretty comfortable now because black plays knight d7, pieces come out, all of black's pieces make sense, right? So his move strived to disrupt that. Knight e5, I'd say it's a little too soon. You're not quite developed enough for knight e5. You have to be very careful trying to play moves like this before you're fully developed, I would say. Queen b3 is actually quite interesting. I don't mind queen b3. It's just sometimes the queen looks funny there later. He opted for queen c2, which is a similar idea. So it looks like kind of a silly move compared to developing a bishop, right? But it prevents bishop f5. Just making sure we're on the same page. And bishop g4 now runs into which move? Knight e5 with tempo on the bishop, right? So again, it's moves like this that can make the subtle difference between ending up with putting a little pressure on your opponent or allowing them to get an easy game. And it's moves that sometimes people fast forward on. So I'm not saying you got to think 10 minutes on queen c2, but spend a couple minutes, figure out what's going on, and maybe you'll find a move that puts more pressure on black. Because you have to admit, whether this move's that much better or not, it's more unpleasant to face, because now black has to make a choice. How exactly do I develop, right? So black played rook e8. White played bishop d3. Knight d7. Castles, all pretty logical, right? Knight f8. So this was another interesting position, I would say. So black's simply trying to get pieces out, trying to get her forces kind of settled. And I don't think that there's only one good way to play for white. I'm sure there are plenty of good moves. Trying to play for b4, for example, I think would be quite reasonable. However, white decided that the best move to play for, the best plan to go for was knight to e5. We talked about this plan, right? Cementing a knight on e5 and trying to put a pawn on f4, right? So the question is, what happens if white plays knight e5 immediately? Yes? Knight g6 is possible. However, after I play f4, I kind of have what I want. You never ever want to take this knight. And if you play f6, your knight's going to be very loose, right? So I think that this is exactly what white would be looking for. But adjust your move a little bit. Yeah?
Maybe knight 6 to d7 and then getting ready for...
Knight 6 to d7, I can still play f4. That's the move you want to not allow. Knight 6 to d7 might be playable, because after f4, I don't know. Knight 6 to d7 is possible, but you'd rather not have to play f6, I would say. Yeah? Yes. Now f4 is impossible, because this pawn hangs. So white would have to probably trade. And as we've discussed, which side do trades favor? Almost always black. There are rare occasions where it's not true, but that kind of trade would be helpful. So instead, white played here. So again, I have a question, and I'd like honest answers. Usually I don't. That's why I'm specifying. How many of you would have, if you were playing over this game, would have saw h3 and been like, all right, h3, and kept going? Without pausing. You probably would just play over this, right? Yeah. That's why, again, I like to pause on these moves. Ask yourself, why is he playing h3? Why couldn't he just play knight e5 immediately? And almost always you'll find an answer. With these guys, they're so strong that, I mean, not that they don't miss things. Of course, they make mistakes and miss things. But usually, almost always, there's a very specific purpose to move orders and why they're doing what they're doing. And one of the reasons they're slightly better than weaker grandmasters is that they get these things right a little bit more often. In any case, I'm not saying h3 is even the best move. It's more like if you're going to play for knight e5, you need to prepare it. So black plays g6. White plays knight e5, sure enough. Knight h5, a little bit of an unusual move. But believe it or not, it's actually not that atypical for these types of positions. What do you think black's idea is, by the way? And again, we're going to assume she knows what she's doing.
Or
Yeah, that's the idea, that if knight e5, knight g4, you have to trade off the knight, which isn't what you want. So that's why white played h3. Yeah?
I thought instead of G6 and H1, I thought instead of knight G6.
Where? Here? You can, but you have to realize this knight is not very good here. It prevents knight e5 temporarily, but this knight blocks all your other pieces. You can't fix this bishop with the way she tries to do it in the game. You can't really move this knight. It does prevent knight e5, but you're kind of stuck. And being stuck is usually not a good thing, because your opponent can switch plans on you, right? And then you're like, wait, why is my knight on g6? Know what I mean? So I'd say in general in these structures, your knight does not want to be here. It would much rather be elsewhere. And we'll go over where that is later. But knight h5 looks like a funny move. So white plays rook e1, but what exactly is the purpose of knight h5?
maybe making rooms, just getting out of the f-pawn's way so we can...
It's quite possible. But I would say that one of the whole reasons of playing knight e5 is not just to put a knight on e5. The knight on e5 doesn't really do that much, right? It's just sitting there. But if you provoke f6, black has a weakness forever. And again, this is something I think a lot of players don't appreciate, which is that you play a move like f6, you can never put it back. If white then opens the center on you, starts complications, you're going to have to deal with that weak king on g8. You're going to have to deal with this bad pawn structure. So white's hoping not necessarily that that this knight's going to be super strong, but that you're going to get sick of having it there and force the knight out. Yeah? For black, I would not recommend this. Then this knight becomes an absolute monster. Do not make this knight become stronger than it already is. But why did white play this? It's actually nothing to do with the f-pawn at all. Whoa. You can, but I wouldn't recommend it just yet. I'd say that you're sacking in exchange for a pawn, right? Would you say it's a position that's going to remain closed a long time? I don't think so. I would say that if you sack this exchange, you need something more to work with. White needs a weakness. White needs something bad. I like that you're thinking the exchange sack. It's a good thing. But you can't do it when it's just you get a pawn and white has no weaknesses whatsoever. You're not going to get enough for your exchange. You'd need something a little bit stronger. Indeed. So there was one subtle point, which is that if white tries to play f4 now, sometimes knight g3 is annoying, which is why white played rook e1. But another point is that often the knight will drop back to g7 and not play knight f5. But what do you think the idea of knight g7 would be? Or? What is black's problem piece? What piece does black want to trade off?
Bishop f5.
Exactly. If black can achieve knight g7, bishop f5, black's doing a lot better. Because once you trade off that bishop, your life becomes a whole lot easier. So this is actually a very typical idea in Carlsbad structures. g6, knight g7. Notice how, unlike positions with, say, the knight on g6, not to pick on your move too much, you have mobility there. You have ideas. You have things you can do. And you always want to make sure that's kind of the case. So this is a very typical idea here. So white played, it was black's move. Black played rook e7. This move's a little mysterious to me, I have to admit. I thought she could just play knight g7 immediately, but it could be she was worried about white switching plans. And as I mentioned, switching plans is an important thing you have to do, right? You can't just be too carried away with your own plan. Maybe white could try this. By the way, this is a very common thing. When your opponent kind of delays stuff too much, maybe creates weaknesses, open the position. So even though e4 technically creates a weakness, look at this initiative you're getting. Knight takes, this square is weak, knight g5 is in the air, bishop c4 is in the air. All of a sudden it's like, whoa, where did this come from, right? And the reason it's possible is because black fiddled around a little too much. So she didn't want to allow this. I still am not crazy about this rook e7 move. To me, it looks a little slow. But here, Svidler finds a very, very interesting way to deal with this move. And he plays a move here which I actually really like. Plays this. Now you're thinking Queen A4 against Rook E7. Josh, you've been on something. But he has a really clever idea. Yeah? B4, B5, exactly. Now, you'll see why having the rook on E7 is particularly good with this idea in the first place. But yeah, so basically the knight on E5's done all it can do, right? So we discussed this. You can't just have one plan. You need to be flexible. So now he's going to switch to playing on the queen side. But you'll see why this is opportune at the moment. So black plays knight D7. So first of all, what do you do here? That's the natural reaction, right? The whole reason you played all your moves was that you can play F4. But I actually think F4 is a very bad mistake here. Black can just do this, force you back, knight G3, and all of a sudden, wait a second, what's happened? Bishop can come out to F5, knight can come to C4. These pawns are actually kind of weak, right? How did this happen? And the way reason it happened is because the position changed. You're no longer ready to play F4. But that's no problem. What did he play? You got to be careful when you get too ambitious with your pawn pushes. It's very easy. Keep in mind, where are you playing? What side of the board are you playing on? You're playing mostly here for now. If you try to push all your pawns, your king's going to end up quite weak. So in general, I'd say unless you're prepared for this, if you had all your pieces concentrated on the queen side, on the king side, I'd say you could try that idea, maybe. But because your queen's out on A4, your rooks are over here, you're not prepared to play on the king side. You try to play on the king side, you're just going to weaken your own king. He plays a very simple move. And again, I think this is a move that a lot of players who aren't as experienced are just not going to look at.
Can I double on C5? Play B4, B5?
Well, yes, but you have an immediate problem here.
I mean, my choices are knight G4 or knight F3, right? Knight G4 looks
Because you don't want to trade, right?
right.
Yeah?
Right, I don't. Because it gives black more space.
Just go back. What's the problem? And again, it's like people, they go forward, they assume they can't go back. Of course you can go back. It's a free country. And the point is that now, wait a second, this knight just went back here and here. This knight now doesn't make sense. You can change your plans. Just because you played knight e5 doesn't mean you must play f4. It doesn't mean the police are going to knock down your door if you don't. Sometimes going backwards is the way to go. Because now black is not well equipped to deal with this b4 idea. So I think she should have tried knight b6 or something here. But instead she played knight df6, which to my eye looked a little strange, but okay. He plays b4. And this is where what he did really comes in handy. Because now, if the rook were back on e8, and black were able to get this bishop out, black would be much better equipped to deal with this b5 push. But because the rooks can't connect, how do you stop b5 here? That's what she did. And now? Whoops. And this was his idea. Because the rooks are disconnected, this is an easy move to play. So it's kind of a cool little trick. So she kind of panicked here. She took and then played here, which I actually think is quite bad. And this is what I mean by pawn structure changes. So this has happened. So there are tactics here, which we'll get to. But forgetting the tactics for just a moment, and usually I'm not going to say the words forget the tactics, so be thankful. What has happened to the pawn structure? Yeah, this pawn's a little lonesome, right? I wouldn't call it a weakness just yet, but in the long term, having this pawn could be quite annoying. What else?
Knight c8, knight d6.
I said forget tactics. Forget tactics. I'm just talking about pawn structure.
Oh, pawn.
Queen side 2 against 1.
Mm-hmm.
It's more or less promising for black.
Yeah, so sometimes the 2 versus 1, if the pawns can get far advanced, can be quite dangerous. So it's something white has to worry about in the future. And again, I mean, it's one of those things I would say that I just know from experience, these pawns take a long time to get going. It's not easy for these pawns to actually create something here. But at the same time, it's something which in the long term is something you have to worry about. But I would say that, and again, I'm really saying forget tactics for the moment. We'll get to tactics. There are plenty of them. We'll get to it. Again, I'm really, this lecture is largely pawn structure focused, but as you keep pointing out and as your brain keeps screaming at you, which it should, you have a tactic here. However, what I want to focus on first is get the positional basis and then look for your tactics. During a game, if you look for tactics first, that's cool. But the main thing is I think that people sometimes forget to keep track of what's changed. When a pawn structure changes, you should be aware of it. You should not be playing the position you were playing when before the pawn structure changed. So another thing I would point out is that white has control over the main file. That's not good for black, right? White's pieces are a bit better. This knight on h5, I still don't understand what it's doing there. So I think that that's where the basis for white's advantage is. Not so much pawn structure, because again, is this a weakness? Not really. Not for the moment. White's main advantage is due to its superior pieces. Now that we've moved to that, someone has a tactic, I think? Yes? No? And I like that this is a very good thing that you immediately spot this, because this is, tactical eye is very important. And believe it or not, Svidler missed it. I can't believe it. I cannot believe it. This is a very strong tactical player. He usually would see this if you wake him up at 3 a.m. and he's half asleep. He would probably spot this immediately. But for some reason, during the game, he just lost his mind. So what is the tactic? Okay. So you're attacking the rook. It doesn't really have a great move, because if rook back to e8, you play knight b6, right? So the rook has to go to e6. And the rook is officially out of squares. If it goes to c6, what happens? If it goes here? Yep. How could such a strong player miss something so simple? My guess is he just wasn't on the lookout. Maybe he was thinking too positionally. He was thinking about pawn structure. He was thinking about other things. But all I know is his move to me makes no sense. He played this. Now forget about the tactic for a minute. Why on earth would you give up your file? It's all very strange. But we'll ignore it for now. He's a much stronger player than I am. I'm sure he had reasons. But he definitely didn't find the best move in this instance. Hou Yifan doesn't need to be asked twice. She pushes her pawn. Yeah, and here he actually plays another bad move. So my guess is sometimes when you don't see the position clearly, when you're missing stuff, you're prone not just to make one bad move, you're prone to make many in a row. Now he makes 2 in a row, but I'd say one of the things super GMs tend to be good at is when the position changes or they miss something, they're good at resetting. Do you guys know what I mean by resetting? Basically, you're like, all right, I missed something. Forget everything I thought I knew about the position. I'm going to figure everything out again. Where do my pieces belong? What are the tactics? What's going on? If you don't reset, you're going to keep missing things until usually you lose. So resetting is a very important thing to do when you blunder, when you miss something big. And I have no doubt that he knew something was up. There's no way he played this and was like, it's all fine. So going back, what should white play here, do you think?
Rook e1.
That's the move I like. Put the rook on the file. I still think white's better here. You still have the file. This bishop, it's a little funny. I don't mean haha funny, but it doesn't look right to me. And black still has this knight, which I don't have any pleasant words to say, so I'm not going to say anything, but I would be very unhappy with that knight. Yeah? Knight e5 was played. But now,
Very nice feedback.
she plays knight d7. And what is your plan?
Oh, wait, that's already.
So this is the problem. You don't really want to play f4 here. Not a move you want to look for. Knight b6 is coming next, maybe, and put the knight on c4. Knight on c4, by the way, would not be fun, right? Not to mention, this knight's almost trapped. I don't know if you realize this. So you have to be very, very careful. So Svidler decides, you know what? I messed this position up. And I don't know if what he did is objectively best, but I really like what he did because it made it so that his position was still, in my opinion at least, the easier one to play. But he made a very interesting decision here. And this is what I mean by the power of resetting. There's no doubt in my mind after knight d7, he was like, all right, Peter, you screwed this up. What's wrong with you, etc., etc. And then he was like, all right, let's reset. I don't want to take on d7. I don't want to play f4. So what do I do?
Knight d takes f7.
That's a little bit too far on the reset button. I don't think you actually want to give up the two knights for a rook and pawn. I'd say the pieces are going to be stronger. I mean, especially a knight gets into c4, this outside passed pawn then really matters in those kind of positions. I would say that's probably too much. But I do like the radical thinking that'll take you far. What else we got?
Let's see one time. Try the second pawn.
Yeah, very nice. So you give up a pawn, but what do you get in return?
The seventh rook.
So again, I don't know if objectively this was the way to go. It's hard. It's really hard to say. Even the computer probably is not so sure. But your position now becomes easier to play. You get a rook on the 7th rank. You're targeting this f7 pawn. Black's bishop on a4 is a little messed up. And by the way, if your opponent has pieces on the edge of the board, I'm looking at you, knight on h5 and bishop on a4. You want to try to open the position. You want your pieces to flow. You want to get threats because black is not well equipped to deal with them with pieces scattered like this. Know what I mean? So I like looking for ways to take the initiative when your opponent has dubious pieces. So again, I can't claim whether this is good or bad. I'm not an oracle, and I'm not AlphaZero, but I would say that this is an idea I like and probably I would want to play. So rook f8. So how do you build your position?
Maybe just double rooks on the C file. No?
I actually like doubling rooks on the c file. The only thing is you have to make sure that this knight gets defended and all this, but he decided to go after the c pawn, the a pawn rather. So she defended it. Always repeat. Now there's a very specific reason, by the way, you always repeat. It could be time, very true. But say your opponent has less time. Rook a7, that's a good question. It could be because after rook e6, you're not going to really be able to take that pawn. Because this knight's going to be pinned, right? I can play rook d8 on you, maybe? Or try something else. I don't know. I mean, it's still not that easy. After rook d8, there's still... Oops. Let's see. There's still maybe this move. So you can't take because I can take back, but maybe here. Looks kind of weird, though, right? Takes. Yeah, I don't know. This bishop is so silly, though, right? Like, what is it doing? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, the knight on d8, though, looks weird, too. It's just a mess, right? But it could be he doesn't really want to take.
And in the end, rook b6, the knight is not coming back.
Ah, rook b6. The problem is you need a way to trap it. King. That's going to be a little slow. I can probably get to you before then. So maybe here. Rook to c7, rook c6. It's a good idea, I mean, trying to trap the knight, but I think it's a little slow. White's not completely helpless, but I would say that white has to be a little careful with a position like this. Keep in mind also, white's not up any material, right? So that's the thing. Sometimes when you have initiative, there's a tendency of people to want to cash in too early. They want to take their material back right away. They're like, I don't want to be down a pawn. But sometimes if you take back your pawn, you give up all that made your position nice, you know? So that's probably why you didn't do that. However, my question was not that. My question was why repeat?
Your opponent may change minds and that will be worse for them.
That could be true. You also see where your opponent's at. Is my opponent okay with a draw? Do they want to try to beat me here? They're up a pawn. What do they think about the position? Sometimes when you repeat, you get information about your opponent. And as you pointed out, which is quite correct, there are a lot of times when you repeat, your opponent, in order not to repeat, plays a bad move. Happens all the time. So you have to be careful with this. If you're repeating a lot in positions that are similar, you don't want to repeat 3 times, right? I actually had a very strong GM do that against me, where I had a worse position, I was suffering. I don't know if I was lost, but it was not fun, and he accidentally repeated 3 times. So I was like, yes, I can go home. But in general, repeating can be a really nice, powerful tactic. I would say almost all GMs do use this trick, where they repeat a lot. And if a GM's repeating against you, it does not mean they want to draw. They're trying to feel you out. They're trying to figure out what you're doing. So I'd say unless you really you think you're better, repeat fairly quickly. Do not let them gain time. Do not let them kind of figure things out. Give them no information. But it is a very common trick, and I'd say, most people do it. In any case, he didn't want to draw. She was having a bad tournament. So Hou Yifan is extremely strong. She's outrated in this tournament. She's one of the players who probably people want to beat just because she's one of the lower rated players. But she's just having a rough event. She's not, in my opinion, she's not particularly well prepared. Like, I don't think her openings have gone that great for the most part. It could be she's going to go to school next year. She's focused on other things. I don't know. Maybe she's just off form. It happens to everyone. I would say Audubon is also in very bad form as well. And that can happen with him because he's a very aggressive player. So if he's playing badly, it can be really bad. Of course, the opposite's true if he's playing well. So, yeah. I thought I saw a hand. But I can't see very much, so it's all good. So Rook C1 was played, so he wants to play on. She played D4, trying to play actively. Again, another very common trait in GM games. If GMs make mistakes, often it's because they're trying to be too active. They don't want to play passively, so they play an active move, which maybe isn't best. So I don't know if this move is actually bad or good, but I would say that it's a little bit risky because you're giving away a pawn. However, she wants to be active. She wants to be aggressive. But I think that White actually had a good move here. So the question is, you have to make a choice. Do you play with an E4 type idea, or do you play with captures? So actually, sorry, I should point out that G4 was played first. So G4, knight F6. So here you have the choice between playing E4 and trying to run with your pawns, or trying to take this pawn. Is there a line? Is there a reasoning? Is there? So again, there is some measure of calculation. I'd say this is mostly calculation. But there's also a pawn structure element. I think he played his move because of pawn structure more than anything else. He's aware that if you get E4, F4, G4, and these pawns start rolling, that's an extremely powerful structure that's very good for the initiative. And I think that he wanted the initiative. Whereas after pawn takes pawn, he thought that black would probably play rook d5. And now this pawn gets taken. This pawn structure, by the way, not as good. You have a hole. You're not really doing anything. But in this position, he had a really, really cool resource, which I think he missed. And it could be he was in time pressure here. So I wouldn't blame him for missing this in time pressure. But you guys aren't going to miss it, of course. Knight takes on b5. Yeah. This is I would say this is risky. Would be the nice word for a move like this. Even if I take with the bishop, I'll be able to take on a2 at the end. You're certainly not really playing for anything there, right? Okay. But I do like the tactical view. Looking for tactics is always good. Knight c8 threatening a fork in the knight. The problem is I can either play king g7 or rook takes d4 even, right? Rook takes d4 probably, and then so you guys are looking for tactics to try to win material, which of course you should be. But given that none of that works, do you have a way to kind of, you need a gluing tactic. Was that too cryptic? Do you guys know what I mean by a gluing tactic? I just made it up, so you probably don't. What it means is that a way to glue your position together tactically, to make it so black can't capture stuff because you have tactics. It's the type of tactic that sometimes people miss. People want to take stuff, but sometimes you just have to stop your opponent from doing it. So you can play rook c8 check, and now, look at that. This move is actually quite nasty. Because say black plays h6, trying to prevent g5 type moves. Logical, right? Knight e8, you just move your king. Doesn't really do anything.
Bishop e4.
Bishop e4.
No.
I don't think so. I can take on d6.
And king f8.
Takes on d6 after bishop b4. But there's a question that people often forget to ask themselves, which is, what is black going to do next? What is black's next move? I'm very curious. If you move the a pawn, you don't have anything else. If you move the b pawn, I have bishop c4, right? This bishop only has one move. It's not particularly thrilling. So what if I just go here and laugh?
Or just bishop e2 and
Bishop e2 looks fine also.
threat to f3.
But bishop e2, maybe bishop c2, bishop here, you're pinned still.
Bishop f3.
Bishop e4 anyway? You're still, oh, but then bishop takes.
Then it works.
Ah, I see. Yeah, bishop e2 might be good as well. But I was thinking even just not do anything.
Or bishop d1.
Yeah. Big deal. Kind of funny, right?
Can I play h5?
You can, but what does that do? I'm just going to wait. Okay, I could play king e3 and try to do stuff too. But the point is that black basically has no moves at all. Yeah, because probably black has to play king h7 at some point, but then you can just take on f7. Kind of funny, huh? So sometimes these things are a little unexpected, but the idea is that this is actually very solid, even though you're pinning yourself because of tactics. And this rook all of a sudden doesn't feel so hot. So my guess would be if he saw this, he would have taken on d4. But he played e4. Rook e6. So of course, what happens now?
F4 time.
This pawn structure is very dangerous, almost always. And note how this pawn is not really doing much of anything, right? But you have to be careful because there are times when you need to move this bishop to activate, to give yourself an initiative, and then all of a sudden this pawn and this bishop look like they work together, you know? So you have to be a little cautious. Black played b4, which does make a threat, it turns out. Yeah, f5, it turns out, would have been a good move. But this was all a little bit complicated. So you can see now that whatever turned from like a Carlsbad, which is like a very positional battle, to b5 happened, and then tactics broke out. So this happens all the time, that your game goes from a positional one to a more tactical one. And you have to make sure that you're kind of going along with the ride. If you try to play, by the way, a very positional game tactically, like you're trying to attack stuff every move, you're going to play pretty badly. But if you try to play this position purely positionally, you're obviously not going to have a very easy time either. So usually you have to find kind of a happy mix. But I guarantee you, he just liked this pawn structure. I would like this pawn structure. We all like this pawn structure. But it's all very concrete. So this happened, e5. All makes sense, right? Knight d5. Mm-hmm. This is why you have to be a little careful. If you take on e6, this d pawn doesn't look so weak anymore, does it? All of a sudden, it's running up the board in record time. This pawn's going to be Usain Bolt. It's just going to be going.
Can I play rook c7?
That is indeed what he did. And unfortunately, yes. So what should black do here? It's a complicated position. Take a few minutes. There's no rush. We got time. Because in my view, what she had to do here was, it wasn't that it was complicated to calculate. It was difficult to kind of realize that this is the way to play. Yes. King h6, I'll take on f7 with the knight, and then laugh.
Okay, strange idea. Knight h3, knight g5.
So I don't think this idea is all that strange. I think it looks pretty nice. My question, I guess, is what happens after this move? That's the move I would fear slightly.
Scared.
And if you try this, which looks to solve all your problems, I can go like this. And then check and take back the rook. Yep. When tactics work, they're pretty cool. I wouldn't know in my games they don't work, but in other people's games they look real fun. So what else you got?
d3 is not.
I'm imagining right now someone walking in. Let's see what pawn structure he's talking about. He sees this mess. So d3 is what was played in the game, but there's a fatal flaw to that one. I think so. But you have to come to terms with something. It's not so much about calculating. It's kind of like accepting a loss. It's like a grieving process. You have to be like, okay, this is the way things are. I'll make the best of it. And I'm guessing she had almost no time, which means that this was extremely difficult. But it's more of a mindset thing than a calculation thing.
But that she has to lose the exchange.
Even worse. Yeah, the problem is if you give up the exchange, you're not just giving up the exchange, you're giving white a monster pawn, right?
Yeah.
So just try taking stuff. Not what could go wrong? Well, I would take this guy first. King h2, for example. King g2 is pretty similar, I think. Just take. You allow this. Looks bad, right? But okay. d3, very nice. If bishop takes, this is a nice fork. Note how the rook's actually badly placed because the knight wants to be there. And what exactly does white do now? Probably white has to stop d2, right? But now you play rook e3 check, king up, attacking this pawn. How many pawns does white have left? But it's not going to be 2 for long, right? So you see what I mean? Sometimes all you have to do is think, wait a second, what happens if I give back a piece? What happens if I give up this? And it's hard to do because you're trying to look for a solution which solves all your problems. You want to be like, all right, I save my piece and take pawns and queen my pawn and I'm the champion. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes you just have to go, okay, I got to give up a piece, but what can I get for it? And that's the hard part. Calculating this is not hard, right? What's hard is to realize, okay, I have to give up a piece. It's okay. I've given up worse than pieces. I certainly have. So, yeah, this was what was necessary. Unfortunately, she did not do this. She played d3, and I'm guessing she just blundered here. So rook takes f7, rook takes f4, and what is the problem now? And both this and this hangs. So if d1, I can just take it. And that's kind of where her position goes amok. So she just resigned. Because now she's going to be down a piece for nothing, pretty much. Because you can't even take this pawn because of knight f7. So, well, I guess you can. Then you get the rook back. But you're going to be down pretty much a whole piece. So that's not going to work out so well, right? So again, crazy game. You know, the pawn structure part of it really was, you know, the beginning, right? It was like, okay, white tried to put a knight on e5, white tried to play for b4, so there were very typical Carlsbad ideas. But as you saw, what happens when after b5 happened? Was the game anywhere near positional? Just blew up into tactics right away, right? And that's often the way it works. So part of it is, I'd say, if you have to take away anything from this game, it's first of all, be flexible with your plans. Was he super attached to the knight on e5? Was he super attached to one plan or another? No, right? He was willing to change his mind. It's an important thing. Know the ideas of your structure, but sometimes you have to go apart from them. Sometimes the regular ideas don't work. You have to do something unusual. To my mind, queen a4 and b4 was really weird looking. But for that position, it worked out well. And then after that, just calculate tactics well and don't miss knight forks is the main gist of that. So anyway, not exactly a classic example, but I hope you guys enjoyed the game and maybe learned something about pawn structures or hanging pieces or something.